It was 3:00 a.m. when I finally stepped away from the operating table. The reattachment surgery, a fiendishly complex procedure on a severed hand, had lasted nearly 10 hours. To save the future of a young construction worker, my hands had performed tens of thousands of microsutures under the microscope, a feat of almost inhuman precision. Only after the final dissolvable protein suture finer than a human hair was tied off with a perfect surgical knot did I feel the stiff, aching pain radiating from the depths of my knuckles. It was as if rusted machine parts were lodging a silent protest. Stripping off the green, sweat-soaked sterile scrubs, I walked to the sink. I mechanically performed the 7-step surgical scrub etched into my very bones. The cold water sluiced over my fingertips, and the citrus scent of the hand soap mingled with the eternal unchanging smell of disinfectant that haunted the hospital corridors. For the past decade, this mixture had been my most familiar, most trusted perfume. It was an invisible barrier shutting out the mundane anxieties of the world beyond the OR and filling my universe with nothing but pure focus and precision. I picked up my phone. The screen was frozen on a message from my husband Julian sent earlier in the evening. "Hey Ev, the deadline for the NIH grant proposal is brutal. Looks like I'll be pulling an all-nighter at the research lab digging through papers and data. You just finished a huge surgery, so go home and get some real rest. And please don't bring me any food. I don't want you to tire yourself out." Every sentence overflowed with the considerate, gentle concern of a husband for his wife, Dr. Julian Croft, the youngest chief of general surgery at the Langford Medical Center, a rising star anointed by the academic community. Of course, in the eyes of many colleagues and senior physicians, he wore a more significant title, the husband of Dr. Evelyn Reed, Associate Head of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery. The son-in-law of Dr. Richard Reed, the hospital's executive director. They were always whispering behind our backs. Julian Croft's success, they'd murmur, was at least half due to my father's connections and his status as a Reed in-law. I never liked those whispers. In my view, an ideal marriage should be like a precision cooperative surgery. He, as the lead surgeon, would attack the core lesion, while I, as the first assistant, would hand him the sharpest scalpel and clear away any operational obstacles. We were a unit, a partnership. If one of us succeeded, we both succeeded. If one fell, we both fell. His success was my success. The thought of him just back from an international conference and still jet-lagged pulling an all-nighter for his grant made the exhaustion from my own surgery melt into a pang of sympathy. I decided to ignore his instructions. From a thermal flask, I took out the beef bourguignon I had slow-cooked especially for him. I'd used his favorite cut of beef and cremini mushrooms, simmering it on low for 3 whole hours. I didn't take the main elevators, the ones teeming with patients and their families. Too many people, too many prying eyes. I'd never been comfortable with the attention. Instead, I slipped through the familiar fire door and took the internal staff staircase on my way to give him a warm surprise meal. The general surgery inpatient wing was so quiet in the dead of night I could hear my own heartbeat. Only the nurse's station cast a faint yellow glow from a desk lamp, adding a small touch of warmth to the silence. But it was on the edge of that very glow that I overheard a conversation that froze me to the spot. "Oh my God, did you hear Dr. Croft is something else? They said he landed at JFK this afternoon and didn't even go home. Went straight from the airport to a dermatologist with that cousin of his." The speaker was one of the new night shift nurses, her voice laced with the irrepressible excitement young people have for gossip. My Rothy's Flats, after 5 years of service, felt nailed to the cold terrazzo floor. A veteran nurse lowered her voice, but the sneer in her tone was as sharp as a needle. "Cousin, please. You should have seen the way he looked at her. Said she was so tired from the business trip her skin was all dry. Wanted to get a hyaluronic acid injection. I think something else must have been tired out. I just feel bad for Dr. Reed. She's the best surgeon in this hospital. Top skills, always calm. How did she end up with a guy like that?" "Shh, keep it down. Dr. Croft is the man of the hour right now. Plus, he's the director's son-in-law. You don't want to get on his bad side." My hands clenched at my sides, my neatly filed nails digging deep into my palms. I felt no pain. As a top plastic surgeon, I knew the pain scale better than anyone. This level of physical stimulus was less than the sting of a simple skin test. It was nothing compared to the creeping paralysis and coldness spreading from my core, as if my heart were being slowly infused with ice water. I didn't storm out and confront them like a character in a TV drama. I didn't kick open the door to the nurse's station and make a hysterical, undignified scene. That would be too crass, too unlike Evelyn Reed. My life's creed was the same as my surgical style, precise, cold, and straight to the lesion. Like a phantom, I turned and walked silently, step by step, to the door of Julian's research lab. It was slightly ajar, leaving a crack just wide enough to peer inside. Through that crack, I saw my husband, the man who was supposedly writing a grant proposal all night, sunk comfortably into the expensive leather sofa in his office. Curled up in his arms was a young, beautiful woman. Even from her profile, I recognized her instantly. Mia Vance, the pharmaceutical sales rep who often came by our department to pitch new fillers and lifting threads. As Mia lifted her face, Julian took a gauze-wrapped ice pack and gently pressed it against her slightly flushed cheek. The gesture was as tender as if he were handling a priceless treasure, a tenderness I had never once witnessed in our 10 years of marriage. Still, hurt Julian's voice was thick with a syrupy affection I had never heard before. "It's killing me. That doctor was so rough he even left a needle mark." Mia cooed, her voice dripping with practiced charm. "You're the sweetest, Dr. Croft. Oh, but if your Ice Queen saw this, wouldn't she come after me with a surgical scalpel?" The Ice Queen, Julian chuckled softly and kissed her smooth forehead. "Right now she's probably too exhausted to even lift a finger. She wouldn't have the energy to care about this. Besides, she's boring. It's either the operating room or the library for her. Not like you. You're soft as water. Makes a man want to protect you again and again. Boring." That was the final verdict on our 10-year marriage from the man I had helped elevate from an ordinary resident to a surgical deity using all of my family's resources. I stood silently in the shadows of the doorway, watching their intimate display with the cold detachment of a bystander. My heart didn't race. My breathing didn't hitch. A decade of professional training had given me the absolute composure to find the optimal point for hemostasis within a tenth of a second, even as an aorta ruptured and blood spewed like a fountain. The lesion was confirmed. The diagnosis was clear. All that remained was to devise the most perfect surgical plan and execute a precise excision. I didn't open the door. That would only escalate the situation and spook the snake, sending it slithering into the underbrush. I turned and walked step by step to the medical waste disposal room at the end of the hall. The beef bourguignon I had so carefully simmered for 3 hours, along with the thermal flask engraved with our anniversary date, I threw decisively into the yellow bin for infectious biohazardous waste. Clang. It was the sound of the bin's lid automatically closing, but to my ears it sounded like a heavy, fortified door in my heart slamming shut for good. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. The home I had poured so much effort into making cozy now looked like a giant contaminated ward teeming with the bacteria of deceit. Guided by the cold moonlight outside the window, I took a new pair of medical-grade latex gloves from a cabinet in the entryway. Then, like the most rigorous of judges, I began to examine my crime scene. On the bathroom counter where my skincare products were kept, I found the residue of an essence that was not mine. The bottle was gone, but a transparent droplet left on the marble countertop gave off a distinct, slightly acrid smell. I dabbed a bit with a cotton swab and brought it to my nose. High-concentration retinol. To prepare for pregnancy, I had cleared the house of every cosmetic and medication containing retinol or salicylic acid 6 months ago. Julian knew this perfectly well. My gaze slowly shifted to the laundry basket nearby. I picked up the white dress shirt Julian had changed out of yesterday and switched on the small medical pen light I carried in my purse, the one used for checking pupillary light reflexes. On the inside of the collar near the second button, I found a faint, powdery trace, almost one with the fabric. Under the cold white light, it had an unnatural ivory tint. Concealer. The shade was light, the texture thick. It had clearly been applied deliberately to cover some dark mark on his skin. I brought the collar to my nose. Besides the faint, oily scent of the concealer itself, I detected the subtle, specific fragrance that lingers on the skin only after intimate contact. Expressionless, I took a sterile sample bag and a cotton swab from my emergency kit, carefully scraped the concealer powder into it and sealed it. On the label I wrote in permanent marker, Sample 1 shirt collar. After all this, I stripped off the gloves and threw them in the trash. I walked into the bathroom and stood before the mirror. The woman in the reflection was pale from the long surgery, with faint dark circles under her eyes. But those eyes were terrifyingly bright, glinting with a cold, sharp light like a pair of freshly honed scalpels. "Julian, since you love to act so much, I'll perform one last surgery with you. I only hope your performance is worthy of the finale I have so meticulously prepared." The next morning, the soft click of a key in the lock announced Julian's return. He was holding a bag from Essa Bagel, my favorite spot in the city, with steam still rising from it. His face wore the perfect blend of fatigue and tenderness, the image of a flawless husband who, even after an all-nighter, hadn't forgotten his wife's breakfast. Hey, you're up. You didn't reply to my text last night, so I figured you were dead tired. Here, eat while it's still warm. He carefully arranged the breakfast on the table, even sticking a straw in a carton of soy milk and pushing it in front of me. I was sitting at the table, a thick, full-color atlas of facial anatomy, open in my hands, slowly turning the pages. The intricate pathways of muscles and nerves in the book were clearer to my eyes right now than any landscape. Yeah, a little tired. I looked up. My gaze, like an invisible precision scalpel, traced a path from his forehead down millimeter by millimeter and stopped at the corners of his eyes. Julian seemed slightly uncomfortable under my scrutiny, unconsciously raising a hand to his face. What? Is there something on my face? Or do I look that rough from pulling an all-nighter? Your eyes, my voice was as flat as if I were stating a clinical fact. Your left orbicularis oculi muscle shows a subtle rigidity, a delay of about 0.2 seconds when you smile. It's minimal, and the arc of the muscle contraction isn't smooth, but you can't fool my eyes. You got Botox. The injection placement was mediocre, and the diffusion wasn't well controlled. The dosage was a bit too high. The perfect smile on Julian's face cracked like a hairline fracture from a scalpel. Upon hearing the word Botox, his pupils contracted almost imperceptibly. A classic, stress-induced pupillary response. Evelyn, what are you talking about? He forced a dry laugh and took a sip of soy milk to hide his fluster. It's probably just from staying up all these nights. My facial nerves must be twitching a bit. You know how stressful this NIH grant is. Right. I closed the book lightly. The heavy art paper made a sharp thwack that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet morning. Pulling all-nighters is bad for you. It can easily cause neurological dysfunction. But I've never heard of someone working on a grant all night and coming back smelling like Joe Malone. The top note is blackberry, the middle is bay leaf, and the base is cedarwood. Were you growing a garden in the research lab last night? Or dissecting some rare specimen? Julian nearly sprayed a mouthful of soy milk. He coughed violently, his handsome face flushing red. It was impossible to tell if it was from the coughing or from the shame. Oh, that must have been Mia Vance. From the pharma company. He finally found a plausible excuse, but his eyes darted around, avoiding my gaze. She came by to drop off some documents for the department yesterday. I bumped into her in the hallway. It must have rubbed off on me then. I watched his clumsy performance in silence. In micro-expression psychology, when a right-handed person lies, their gaze unconsciously shifts to their own upper right. They are accessing the imaginative centers of the brain to construct false images and scenarios. Julian's current gaze was a textbook example. The atmosphere in the room instantly became as cold and heavy as an operating room. Julian sat across from me, fumbling with a napkin to wipe his mouth. He didn't dare look at me again. I didn't press him further. I just ate the now cold bagel in silence, bite by bite. I couldn't taste a thing. He thought the crisis had passed. He thought my silence meant acquiescence, a compromise. He didn't know me at all. For a surgeon, silence never means the end. It only signifies the completion of the pre-operative observation phase and the imminent beginning of a silent, precise excision. After the tasteless breakfast, Julian went to take a shower, claiming he needed to wash off the fatigue. I picked up my phone. A new message from Ethan Cole, my lawyer, was on the screen. Ethan was a former patient. An accident had left a long, ugly scar on his arm, and I had personally performed the scar revision surgery. Now he was one of the top lawyers in the city, specializing in complex medical litigation. He was one of the very few people I could trust. Dr. Reed, I have the account transaction records you requested. They're more interesting than we thought. Ethan's text was as cool and efficient as he was. A woman named Mia Vance purchased a lava orange Porsche 718 from a dealership in Manhattan last month. Paid in cash over $100,000. The payment came from an account in the name of a Charles Miller who, after some digging, turns out to be a distant cousin of Julian's from his hometown. The man is a day laborer in a rural area. There's no way he could afford this. It's a classic shell account. Additionally, $300,000 was withdrawn from your and Julian's joint investment portfolio last week. The purpose was stated as a down payment for a luxury condo in Soho. As far as I can tell, the title for that condo is not in either of your names, but in the name of a woman who shares the same name as Mia Vance. Staring at the shocking numbers on the screen, I felt the temperature of my blood drop degree by degree all the way to freezing. $300,000. That was the money I had suggested we save together on our 5th wedding anniversary. I had told him we would use it to give our future child the best education. Julian had held me then, his eyes even welling up with emotion, telling me I was the best wife in the world. It turned out that the best education he was talking about was for him, his mistress, and their potential illegitimate child. Julian, you didn't just steal my heart. You were using my money to carve it out of my chest. For my future child. This knife cut with such precision, such cruelty. I took a deep breath, my fingers moving quickly over the cold screen. Thank you, Ethan. Please prepare the petition to freeze all our assets immediately, as soon as possible, and use your connections to pull all of Mia Vance's medical records from our hospital, especially her OB/GYN records. Everything from the first time she ever stepped through our doors. Leave no stone unturned. Ethan replied almost instantly. Are you sure? Once we file to freeze the assets, it's all-out war. It's going to be a tough fight. There's no turning back. I raised my head and looked at the blurry silhouette humming and showering behind the frosted glass of the bathroom door. A cold smile touched my lips. I am a surgeon. What I do best is to completely resect tissue that has already turned necrotic or even cancerous, right down to the root. In front of Julian, I called the private client line for our bank and put it on speaker. A sweet, polite voice came from the other end. Good morning, Dr. Reed. This is the Goldman Sachs Private Wealth Management Desk. How may I help you today? Julian had just stepped out of the bathroom, water dripping from his hair. When he heard the call, the relaxed expression on his face instantly froze. Hello, my voice was cool and clear. Each word was a scalpel, precisely cutting into Julian's nerves. I'd like to immediately report all of my personal and family credit cards as lost, and I want to request a temporary freeze on all joint accounts held by myself and Julian Croft. Certainly, Dr. Reed. May I ask the reason for the report and the freeze? I lifted my eyes and looked directly into Julian's face, which was beginning to turn pale. I said slowly, the reason is a suspected severe security breach on the accounts, with the possibility of unauthorized use by a third party for large, unethical expenditures made without my consent. The representative on the other end was momentarily flustered, but quickly recovered her professional composure. Understood, Dr. Reed. Your request has been processed. The associated cards and accounts will be frozen within the next minute. You will receive a text message with further details. When I hung up, a deathly silence filled the room. Almost simultaneously, Julian's phone pinged. It was the freeze notification from the bank. He stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief like a statue carved from stone. Evelyn, what the hell are you doing? He finally snapped out of it, his voice distorted with rage and humiliation. Oh, I put down my phone and continued to flip through the facial anatomy atlas as if discussing the weather. The bank's risk management system must have detected some recent large-scale abnormal spending. Buying a car and preparing to buy a condo in such a short period of time, they probably thought our accounts were hacked. I can explain, he stammered. But in the face of cold, hard facts, he realized any words were pale and powerless. What can you explain? I finally closed the book, stood up and walked towards him step by step. I was a head shorter than him, but my presence made him instinctively take a step back. Julian, we've been married for 10 years. You know better than I do where every single penny in this house came from. Your PhD, tuition, the renovation of your parents' farmhouse, the security deposit for your sister's study abroad program, even the Armani shirt you're wearing right now. Is there a single thing that didn't come from me or from my father? My voice wasn't loud, but every word pierced his heart. I thought we were family partners in battle. So I thought what was mine was yours. But now I see you just saw me as an ATM with an unlimited withdrawal limit, a stepping stone for you to climb on. Well, the ATM is now broken, and I'm kicking the stepping stone out from under you. You can't do this to me. The blood drained from Julian's face. He started to ramble. We're married. Our assets are marital property. What you're doing is illegal. Married, I laughed, a laugh that didn't reach my eyes. Dr. Croft, you have the nerve to keep a woman on the side, but you don't have this basic legal knowledge. Do you know what the consequences are in a divorce proceeding for secretly transferring marital assets? As it happens, my lawyer is coming over today. You can consult with him directly. With that, I didn't even glance at him again. I went into the walk-in closet, pulled out a pre-packed suitcase, and started adding a few more things. I wasn't the one leaving. I was preparing to completely eradicate the virus from this house. With this one cut, I had severed his financial lifeline. And this was only the beginning. Around noon, the pager in the plastic surgery outpatient clinic chimed. Patient Mia V. Please proceed to consultation room 9. The door opened quietly. The person who entered didn't have the usual anxiety of a patient. Instead, she surveyed my office with a scrutinizing, almost provocative air. Even though she had most of her face covered by large Chanel sunglasses and a medical mask, I recognized her silhouette at a glance. It was Mia Vance. She was wearing a form-fitting silk dress that showcased her proud curves, and in her hand was a limited-edition Hermes Birkin bag. I had just seen the price of that bag on the bill for Julian's now-frozen family card. Dr. Evelyn Reed, I've heard so much about you. Came here on your reputation. She took off her sunglasses, revealing a pair of doe-like eyes exquisitely lined. She looked at me with a flirtatious, half-smiling gaze. They say your hands are magical, that you can reinvent a face, turn stone into gold. So I came to have you take a look at me. Especially this nose. Do you think there's any room for it to be even more perfect? This was a blatant, undisguised provocation. The mistress brazenly walking into the wife's office, asking the wife to make her even more beautiful. This was probably the most thrilling, most triumphant scene she had scripted for herself. What she wanted to see was my composure crumble, my anger, my jealousy. Unfortunately for her, she had picked the wrong audience. I put down the patient chart in my hand and said calmly to the intern who was preparing to take notes, "Dr. Kim, could you please step out for a moment? Close the door on your way out. This is a special friend of mine." The intern hesitated for a second, but obediently left, thoughtfully closing the door behind him. The room now held only the two of us. "Have a seat." I gestured to the patient chair across from me, my voice as placid as if I were addressing any other patient. Mia sat down gracefully, deliberately puffing out her chest to accentuate her curves. "Dr. Croft always says my nose is the most beautiful one he's ever seen. A perfect water drop tip. But I'm a perfectionist. I was thinking the tip could be just a little more refined. You're the top authority in this field, Dr. Reed. What do you think?" I rose from my chair, went to the sterilizer nearby, and took out a new pair of sterile examination gloves, which I slowly put on. Then I walked over to her and looked down at her triumphant face. "Tilt your head up." My voice wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable command. Mia unconsciously complied. My gloved fingers lightly touched the tip of her nose. Her skin was very smooth, clearly well cared for. But what I was feeling wasn't just skin and subcutaneous tissue. Beneath that thin layer, I could clearly feel the contour and edges of an artificial implant. I used my thumb and forefinger to precisely pinch her fragile nasal septum cartilage. Mia gasped and recoiled. "That hurts. There's tenderness here," I stated coldly, not removing my fingers but instead moving them slowly up the bridge of her nose. I stopped abruptly at her glabella, the area between her eyebrows, an L-shaped silicone implant. Judging by the insertion plane and the state of the capsular formation, it was done about 3 years ago. The technique was crude. The implant has already shifted about 2 millimeters to the right and is starting to compress the surrounding fascial tissue. The smug smile vanished from Mia's face, replaced by a flash of panic. "That's impossible. I had it done at the most famous clinic in Beverly Hills. Even famous doctors make mistakes." I withdrew my hand and looked down at her as if she were an imperfect anatomical specimen. "And I should warn you, due to the implant's malposition, the pressure on your nasal septum cartilage is continuously increasing. When he kisses you, if he accidentally uses too much force, or the angle is wrong, and he hits that pressure point directly, it will cause a perforating necrosis right here." I pointed to the spot just below the tip of her nose. "If that happens, the tip of your nose will collapse, and your entire nose will be ruined like a caved-in tunnel." The difficulty of that kind of reconstructive surgery. Even with my magical hands, I can't guarantee I could fix it. The arrogance and provocation in Mia's eyes were instantly replaced by fear. She subconsciously raised a hand to cover her prized nose, her voice trembling. "You're just trying to scare me. I'm a doctor. I don't scare patients. I only state facts and possibilities." I returned to my seat, took off the gloves, and tossed them accurately into the biohazard bin. "And Miss Vance, your cheekbones are already starting to clump and sag from excessive filler injections. Instead of thinking about making your already precarious nose more beautiful, you might want to see a neurosurgeon first and get your brain checked. Before you try to take what belongs to someone else, you should at least see if you're destined to enjoy it." Stabbed in her two most vulnerable spots, her appearance and her status, Mia finally dropped her pretense. She shot up from her chair and pointed at me, enraged. "Evelyn Reed, you think you're so great with your fancy title. Let me tell you, Julian doesn't love you anymore. He says you're like a corpse in bed that just looking at you makes him sick." The one he loves is me. Finally showing your true colors. I looked at her contorted, angry face and found it both ridiculous and pathetic. Yes, he does. I sat back down at my computer unmoved and typed a few keys, pulling up her electronic medical record. This was my authority and my weapon. Mia Vance, age 26. I looked at the screen and read aloud word for word. Each syllable was like an invisible slap across her face. In the last 6 months, you have visited the OB/GYN department of this hospital 3 times. The records indicate first visit threatened miscarriage, second incomplete medical abortion, third dilation and curettage procedure. The name signed on the surgical consent form as next of kin is Julian Croft. I looked up and met her eyes, which were now filled with shock and terror. The color drained from Mia's face, leaving it as white as paper. She lunged forward, trying to cover my computer screen, her voice shrill. "Shut up, that's a violation of patient privacy. I'll sue you. I am your attending physician. According to regulations, I have the right to review all of your past medical records within this institution to make a comprehensive assessment of whether your physical condition is suitable for your next surgery." I looked at her coolly, leaning back to avoid her touch. "So it turns out Julian didn't just buy you bags and cars. He gave you such a big gift, too. It's a pity his powerful genes didn't seem to like you as a host. They came and went. You couldn't even hold on to them." Mia was trembling all over. She pointed at me, her lips quivering, unable to form a coherent sentence for a long moment. "Evelyn Reed, you just wait. I'll make Julian divorce you. And when he does, you'll be left with nothing. Goodbye." I swiveled my chair, turning my back to her, not even deigning to look at her again. As I listened to the sound of her heels clattering in a panicked retreat, the coldness in my eyes finally solidified into the hardest ice. "Of course we'll get a divorce. But before that, I'm going to make you vomit up every single penny you swallowed from me, with interest and every last drop of my blood, sweat, and tears." The day after Mia fled my office, I met Ethan Cole at a cafe near my lab. He was, as always, in a well-tailored dark suit and gold-rimmed glasses, exuding the cool, sharp air of a top legal mind. He pushed a thick manila envelope across the table to me. Inside was all the ammunition I would need. "Here is all the information you requested." Ethan took a sip of his black coffee, no cream, no sugar, and watched me quietly with his deep-set eyes. "Dr. Reed, if you don't mind me saying, you've really changed. The Evelyn I knew used to agonize over the optimal angle of an incision and the suturing method for a simple appendectomy, worried about leaving even 1 extra millimeter of scar tissue. Now, you wield the scalpel with quite a ruthless edge." I flipped through the documents, my fingers slowly tracing over the cold paper of his bank statements and transfer records. Without looking up, I said, "People change, especially when you realize the person lying next to you isn't your lover, but a viper, ready to strike at any moment." The files detailed Julian's trips with Mia to Europe and various resorts, all under the guise of attending academic conferences. Every credit card charge at a luxury boutique, every bill from a 5-star hotel, was like a small needle being driven into the trust I once had. More damning were several large, inexplicable wire transfers. The senders were without exception major pharmaceutical and medical device companies, the same ones that coincidentally had become the primary suppliers for the general surgery department in the last 2 years. This money was eventually funneled through several shell companies and complex channels into Mia's personal accounts. It was a classic case of commercial bribery and money laundering. Julian was smart, or rather, he was cautious. He didn't dare receive these dirty kickbacks in his own accounts, instead using Mia as the perfect intermediary and firewall. I've checked all the procurement contracts with these companies. They were all signed after Julian was promoted to Chief of General Surgery. Ethan tapped a finger on the document. "If all this evidence comes out, Dr. Croft won't just lose his position. He'll lose his medical license and probably spend a few years in prison." "Not yet," I said, closing the file and putting it in my briefcase. "If I release this now, it could be dismissed as a financial dispute. He could even countersue, claiming I'm maliciously framing him because our marriage is falling apart. What I want isn't as simple as sending him to prison. I want him to be socially ostracized, nailed to a pillar of shame, and never able to recover." I looked up at Ethan. "Mr. Cole, I need you to do something for me. File for an injunction in my name to prevent Julian from disposing of our jointly owned real estate in any way, and then have a few discreet surveillance cameras installed in the living room and study of our home." Ethan's eyes narrowed behind his glasses, a flicker of understanding in them. "You're trying to lure the snake out of its hole." "No," I shook my head, a cold smile on my lips. "I'm going to make him dig his own grave. Julian's desperation came sooner than I expected. With all his financial support cut off, he not only had to deal with Mia's mounting expenses, but more importantly, he began to face pressure from the medical device companies that had paid him kickbacks to get their new expensive consumables onto the hospital's procurement list. With his cash flow blocked and pressure coming from all sides, he started thrashing around like a caged beast, desperately seeking a way out. First, he tried to grovel. He came to me begging, swearing he was done with Mia, pleading for just one more chance. He asked me to unfreeze the joint accounts for the sake of their 10 years of marriage. I simply replied that in my world, once a scalpel makes an incision, it is never sutured back. There is only complete resection of the necrotic tissue. When the soft approach failed, he turned to force. He started coming home more often, not to reconcile, but to rummage through the house looking for the property deeds and my ID. He was plotting to secretly take out a mortgage on our marital home behind my back. That night, through the remote feed from the surveillance cameras, I watched everything unfold in the study. Julian was in front of the safe, sweating and frantic. He tried every combination he could think of, but he couldn't open the safe whose combination only I knew. Finally, losing his temper, he grabbed a trophy from the desk and began smashing it against the safe in a mad frenzy, venting his rage at his own incompetence. Then he slumped to the floor and made a call. The person on the other end was a loan shark. "Hello, Tony. It's Julian." "Yeah. Listen, I'm in a bit of a tight spot. I need some cash fast. 50,000. The interest isn't a problem. I don't have collateral, but you know my wife is the hospital director's daughter, right? Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere." I watched the man on my phone screen, his face contorted and ugly as he sold off his family's reputation for money. The last shred of warmth in my heart shattered completely. I saved the video clip and forwarded it to Ethan Cole. "Ethan," I messaged, "the snake has started to move. It's time to draw the net." Before the net could be fully drawn, an unexpected yet seemingly fated turn of events came crashing down in a horrific way. 3 days later, I was in my lab, organizing surgical plans for cleft lip and palate reconstructions. The frantic ringing of my phone sliced through the quiet of my lab like a blade. It was Dr. Kim, the attending physician on duty in the ER. His voice was trembling uncontrollably with extreme tension and fear. "Dr. Reed, you need to get to the ER now. Dr. Croft. He was in a car accident." My heart at that moment did not skip a beat, as one might expect. It just continued to pump blood steadily and methodically. I stood up, my brain switching from work mode to emergency mode in half a second. What's the patient's condition? Are his vitals stable? Any other casualties? My voice was so calm it was hard to believe it belonged to a wife who had just heard her husband was in an accident. I sounded like any surgeon receiving an urgent consult. "Dr. Croft has an open comminuted fracture of his left arm and a laceration on his forehead. He's still conscious. But the woman in the passenger seat is in very bad shape. Her face is a mess of blood and she's already in shock." Within 5 minutes, I had grabbed my coat and car keys and was running out of the lab. 15 minutes later, my car skidded to a stop at the entrance to the emergency room. The thick smell of blood and disinfectant mingled to create the suffocating atmosphere unique to an ER. The scene was chaotic. Julian was on a gurney near the entrance. His left arm was bent at an unnatural angle, with white bone fragments piercing through the skin, a textbook open comminuted fracture. His forehead had a wide gash caked with blood and dirt, but he was relatively lucid. The person on the adjacent gurney, however, was not so lucky. It was Mia. Her face was so covered in blood that she was unrecognizable. I later learned from the police report that at the time of the crash, she hadn't been wearing a seatbelt and had flown headfirst into the windshield like a rag doll. The face she had been so proud of, the one she had spent so much money and effort to perfect, was now a canvas of deep lacerations of all shapes and sizes, some so deep you could see bone. A shard of white zygomatic bone was faintly visible. Evelyn Julian's eyes lit up when he saw me, as if I were the only lifeline in a sea of darkness. Ignoring the nurse's shouts of "Dr. Croft, don't move," he used his good right hand to brace himself on the gurney rail, struggled and then tumbled off the gurney. Yes, tumbled. With a dull thud, he landed pathetically on the cold floor. He was kneeling before me. "Evelyn, please save her. Please, you have to save her." Julian clutched at the hem of my white coat with his good hand, desperate. Tears and snot streamed down his face, all traces of the suave academic star gone. "Her face is everything to her. If her face is ruined, her life is over. You're the best in this field, in the hospital, in the country. Only you can save her. If you fix her, I'll do anything, I swear. I'll break it off with her for good. I'll never see her again." The entire ER fell silent for a moment. Every medical staff member, every patient on a gurney, every anxious family member, dozens of pairs of eyes turned on us like spotlights. This was my husband. For his mistress, he ignored his own broken arm and knelt before his wife in front of a crowd of strangers, begging her to save his lover's ruined face. What a moving, earth-shattering love story. I looked down at Julian kneeling at my feet. My gaze was as calm as a frozen lake that wouldn't thaw for 1,000 years. There was no anger, no sadness, not even a ripple of emotion. Dr. Croft. I slowly pried his fingers off my coat one by one. My voice wasn't loud, but it echoed clearly through the ER. I am a doctor. Saving people is my duty. I paused, then added, "You don't have to beg." I turned, no longer looking at him, and walked straight to Mia's gurney. Mia was semi-conscious from blood loss, but she instinctively flinched when she heard my voice. Her eyes narrowed to slits by the swelling, and blood stared at me in terror. A weak moan escaped her lips like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. She was afraid. She was afraid that the scalpel that was about to operate on her face was not for saving lives but for taking them. I ignored her fear. I took out my pen light, lifted her eyelids, and checked her pupillary light reflexes. Then, putting on sterile gloves, I gently and professionally probed the depth and contamination of her wounds. Preliminary diagnosis: multiple severe soft tissue lacerations of the face with retention of glass foreign bodies, comminuted fracture of the nasal bone, depressed fracture of the left zygomatic arch, high risk of damage to the buccal and marginal mandibular branches of the facial nerve. I quickly and coolly made my initial assessment. I looked up at the flustered ER attending Dr. Kim. Get a type and cross-match ready immediately. Contact anesthesiology and the main OR and prepare for emergency surgery. My voice cut through the noisy ER like a sharp scalpel, silencing all the chaos. Tell the OR I'll be operating myself. A full facial debridement, suturing and open reduction with internal fixation of the fractures. Julian, still slumped on the floor, gasped for air. A flicker of relief, the relief of a survivor, crossed his eyes, but it was overshadowed by a bone-deep fear of me. He knew. From this moment on, Mia's fate, the future of the face he had once been so captivated by, was now completely and utterly in my hands. The shadowless lamp in the operating room cast a cold, bright white light, illuminating everything on the surgical table without mercy. I stood in the lead surgeon's position, my arms crossed. A scrub nurse skillfully helped me into a sterile gown, tying the straps behind my back. Every movement was as solemn as a ritual. Mia lay quietly on the table, completely sedated by the anesthesiologist. Her once glamorous face, now a mangled mess of flesh and blood, looked grotesque and fragile under the intense light, like a piece of roughly handled meat awaiting delicate repair. Let's begin. My voice, muffled by the mask, sounded somewhat flat but unnaturally calm. I held out my gloved right hand. The first assistant placed a gleaming Hashanatu scalpel firmly in my palm. This was a surgery that would test my skill, patience, and mental fortitude to the absolute limit. Countless tiny shards of glass were embedded like malicious seeds deep within her muscle layers, some even close to the periosteum. I had to incise the skin layer by layer, expose the wound, and then use delicate microforceps to remove them one by one, completely intact. In this process, I had to avoid the web of nerves and blood vessels in her face, especially the facial nerve. It was like a delicate tree with a slender trunk and complex branches controlling every subtle human expression. If my hand trembled even for a moment, or if I deliberately cut even 1 millimeter deeper when debriding necrotic tissue, she would become a lifelong victim of facial paralysis, unable to smile, unable to frown, the corner of her mouth permanently drooped. Behind the frosted glass of the observation deck, I could vaguely see Julian's silhouette, but I could clearly feel his posture, his eyes fixed on my hands. His gaze was like 2 X-ray beams trying to penetrate the walls, penetrate my gloves to monitor every incision, every suture. I knew what he was watching for, what he was afraid of, what he was betting on. He was betting on whether my professional ethics, the Evelyn Reed suture technique that was practically textbook material, would hold. At the same time, he was betting on whether my hatred for him would lose control at this moment and turn this scalpel into an instrument of revenge. Unfortunately for him, he didn't know me at all. Under the microscope, the red muscle fibers, the white nerve bundles, the yellow fat globules were magnified hundreds of times, forming a clear, cold, microscopic world. In this world, there was no love, no hate, no tangled emotions. There were only anatomical structures and tissue planes. I coolly debrided the wound, separating each blood and pus-stained glass shard from her flesh. I had the nurse count each removed piece, cross-referencing it with the count from the preoperative CT scan to ensure not a single one was missed. Professor, we're only 0.5 millimeters from the main trunk of the facial nerve here, said my first assistant, Dr. Lee, a resident I was training. His voice was tense and fine beads of sweat had already formed on his forehead. I know. My voice was as cold as ice without a tremor. Retractor 0.2 millimeters more tension. Hold it steady. I made the cut. The blade followed the edge of the nerve bundle at an incredible angle, precisely excising the last piece of contaminated necrotic tissue. The entire process was clean without a single superfluous movement. This was not just a surgery. It was a silent, extreme psychological battle. I could have easily ruined her, turned her into a monster who could never face people again. But I didn't. What I was going to do was the exact opposite. I was going to use my life's work to give her a perfect face, a recovery that was from a technical standpoint almost a miracle. I wanted her every time she looked in the mirror from now on to see the hair-thin scars, and remember that this face was a gift bestowed upon her stitch by painstaking stitch by the very wife she had so hated and despised. This humiliation would follow her for the rest of her life, deeper than any ugly scar. The suturing began. I opted out of standard sutures and chose the most expensive German-imported cosmetic sutures. They were finer than a human hair. The angle of every stitch, the alignment of the subcutaneous tissue layers, the tension of every knot, I controlled everything with flawless precision. I wasn't just closing skin. I was restoring a shattered work of art. But on this work of art, I left my signature. At several key muscle attachment points, I intentionally altered the tension vector of the sutures. The change was so subtle that it would be completely undetectable in any post-operative imaging. But over time, as her muscles began to recover their motor function, these altered anchor points would create an infinitesimal but permanent disharmony in her expressions. She would be able to smile, but her smile would always have a hint of stiffness. She would be able to cry, but her sad expression would look somehow artificial. She would forever be unable to produce a truly natural, heartfelt expression. Her face would become an exquisite mask eternally out of sync with her inner self. For a full 3 hours, the only sounds in the OR were the crisp clink of instruments and the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. When the final suture was tied, I put down the needle holder. I looked at the densely packed but perfectly aligned sutures on Mia's face. They looked like ugly centipedes temporarily squatting on this face, waiting to either transform or to rot. "Professor, that's perfect, my first assistant," Dr. Lee said with genuine admiration. "To restore and suture such severe damage to this degree, this is a textbook miracle." I took off my blood-stained mask, revealing a face devoid of expression from the extreme concentration. "Transfer her to the ICU for recovery. Monitor her vitals closely." As I pushed open the heavy doors of the OR, the bright lights momentarily blinded me. Julian, his arm in a plaster cast, was the first to rush over. His face was pale, his lips chapped. His eyes were filled with a complex, indescribable mix of probing fear and a faint glimmer of hope. "Evelyn, how is she?" I took off my heavy surgical cap and rubbed my stiff neck. I looked up at him quietly. "She'll live. Her face is stitched up." Just as Julian's anxious heart was about to settle, I continued enunciating each word clearly. But I only sutured the wound and gave her a chance. Whether this wound will grow new tender flesh, or whether it will fester and rot, leaving a permanent scar, that's in God's hands. I took a step closer to him. My body still carried the unique scent of the OR, the smell of blood and cold disinfectant. The smell made him unconsciously take half a step back. "Julian," I leaned in and whispered in his ear, my voice low and clear. I fixed her broken face. "But this colossal mess you two have made, you'd better stitch it up yourself. And if you don't do it right," I paused, "I will personally come and rip out every single one of your stitches." Mia woke up from the anesthesia at dawn the next day. The first thing she saw was the stark white ceiling of the intensive care unit and the monitors beside her flashing with various data. When she tried to move, an intense pain shot from every nerve ending in her face like 1,000 hot needles piercing her at once. She couldn't help but let out a pained moan. She instinctively tried to raise her hands to touch her face, only to find them secured to the bed rails with wide restraints, a standard ICU procedure to prevent a disoriented patient from scratching their wounds. When I led my team into her private room for morning rounds, Julian was sitting by the bed clumsily, using his good right hand to dab Mia's parched lips with a water-soaked cotton swab. The scene looked quite tender and tragic. The moment she saw me enter, Mia's body went rigid. Her eyes were filled with an unconcealable fear and hostility. Dr. Evelyn Reed, Associate Head of Plastic Surgery. It's time for rounds, I said, my tone professional and cold, ignoring their silent exchange. Julian shot up from his chair like a scalded cat, respectfully making way for me. He even obsequiously drew the curtains to the side as if I were the department head. I took a small mirror from a nurse and walked to the head of Mia's bed. "Would you like to see your new face?" My voice was devoid of warmth. Mia shook her head frantically, tears instantly welling up and soaking the thick bandages wrapped around her head. "Don't cry," I said, coldly cutting off her emotional outburst. "The salt and protein in tears are an excellent breeding ground for bacteria. It will irritate your delicate wounds and could cause suture rejection and hypertrophic scarring. If you want to be a monster with red, fleshy worms crawling all over your face when the stitches come out, then by all means keep crying." My words were like a bucket of ice water, instantly extinguishing her sorrow. Mia immediately stopped crying, biting her lip so hard her face turned red, her chest heaving violently. But she didn't dare shed another tear. "You're going to look ugly during the recovery period. This is a normal physiological process." I placed the mirror at the head of her bed in a position where she could see it just by turning her head. "Miss Vance, your face is like a shattered piece of precious porcelain right now. I spent a great deal of effort using the best adhesive to piece it back together. If you have emotional fluctuations during the recovery period causing abnormal local vasodilation, or if you fail to follow doctor's orders, these reattached pieces could pull apart at any time. And when that happens, not even a god could save your face." I leaned down and whispered in her ear at a volume only we could hear, almost a breath. "Remember, in this hospital, I am the only one who can save your face right now. If you piss me off again, or if you don't cooperate with any of the upcoming dressing changes or suture removals, I have 100 perfectly reasonable, medically justifiable ways to make your face rot slowly and bit by bit. And you will never find a single flaw in your medical records that could hold me accountable." Mia's pupils contracted violently with extreme terror. She tried to reach a trembling hand for Julian's sleeve as if seeking protection, but my gaze stopped her mid-air and her hand fell limply. She was completely cowed. In this white tower, I was one of the rule makers, while she was just a lowly patient lying in bed, unable to even control her own face. Her life and death were now in my hands. I straightened up, looking with satisfaction at the terror in her eyes, and then left the room. In the hallway, I stopped Julian, who had followed me out. Miss Vance's emergency surgery used a lot of imported suture materials and antibiotics. With the cost of future scar treatment medication, the medical bills are not going to be small. I took out my phone and deliberately opened my banking app, showing him our joint account, which was nearly empty. "It seems our joint account is a bit low. As her guardian, shouldn't you be paying for this?" Julian's face instantly turned an ugly, liver-like color. He knew better than anyone that most of the funds in our joint account had been slyly transferred by him to pay for Mia's Porsche and the down payment on the Soho condo he never got. As for his own private slush fund, it was a drop in the bucket compared to these kinds of medical expenses. "Evelyn, I'm a little short on cash right now," he said, his voice as small as a mosquito's buzz. Could you maybe take some out of the household emergency fund? I'll borrow it." The emergency fund, I laughed, a laugh that held no mirth. "Dr. Croft, as far as I know, your entire monthly income, salary, bonuses, stipends combined is only about $20,000 or $30,000. Miss Vance's surgery alone will cost at least $100,000. Are you telling me that I, the wife you betrayed, should now bankrupt our household to support your mistress?" My voice wasn't loud, but colleagues passing by in the hallway couldn't help but cast curious glances our way. Julian's face alternated between red and white. He looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "No, that's not it. I'll borrow it. I'll pay you back, I promise," he pleaded. "Borrow it," I raised an eyebrow, pretending to seriously consider his proposal. "All right. As it happens, my lawyer Ethan Cole will be here later. We can have him draft a legally binding loan agreement on the spot. The interest will be calculated at the bank's highest prime rate for commercial loans. And for collateral, I'll need the keys and title to that lava orange Porsche 718 inches, Mia Vance's name." Julian's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white. But in the end, like a defeated rooster, he let them fall limply. He knew he had no choice. "Fine. We'll do it your way." Watching him nod his head in humiliation like a stray dog, I felt no pleasure, only a bone-deep, cold revulsion. The financial blockade on Julian was just the first step in this large-scale debridement. Now I was going to make him pay a much heavier price for his stupidity and betrayal. Ethan Cole was astonishingly efficient. In less than half a day, he appeared at our usual quiet cafe with a thick file and a laptop. Not only had he uncovered all of Julian's illicit financial flows from the past 2 years, but he had also found something even more interesting than I had imagined. I had a professional academic agency conduct a comparative data analysis of the key journal articles Dr. Croft published for his promotion as you requested. Ethan adjusted his glasses and handed me a printed report. The results are very interesting. In one paper on minimally invasive stomach cancer surgery published in a Lancet subsidiary journal, we found clear signs of modification and embellishment in a key set of post-operative follow-up data. To put it bluntly, it's academic fraud. I took the report and looking at the p-values that were circled in red for being statistically and blatantly illogical, my fingers tightened. I remembered that paper. It was the one Julian had rushed to publish just before the deadline for his promotion to chief 3 years ago. At the time, he had told me himself that he was running out of time and hadn't managed to compile the key post-operative follow-up data. Evelyn, can you run this model and make the data look a little prettier for me? I just need the p-value to be under 0.05. No one ever rechecks the raw data for these kinds of retrospective studies anyway. Back then, blinded by the ideal of a marital partnership, I had actually stayed up all night helping him embellish that data. How foolish I had been. I thought I was helping my husband, but in reality I was handing the sharpest knife to his shameless opportunism. Do you still have the original draft of that data? Ethan asked. I do, I nodded. I have a habit of backing up the raw files for every major project I'm involved in. That draft is locked in the safe in my study. Then we have him. A cold smile spread across Ethan's lips. Financial misconduct plus academic fraud. These two bombs combined will be enough to blow him to pieces. As we were talking, my phone rang. It was the hospital's billing office. Mia's daily hospitalization fee had not been paid, and they informed me that if it remained overdue, they would have to suspend the supply of certain non-essential expensive medications according to protocol. I hung up the phone and looked at the overcast sky outside. I knew it was time to apply a little more pressure on Julian. I called him. Hello, Evelyn. Julian's voice on the other end was tired and hoarse. When are you going to pay Miss Vance's medical bills? I asked, my voice direct and devoid of warmth. I'm trying to figure something out right now. Evelyn, can you just give me 2 more days? Dr. Croft, I cut him off. I am not a bank, nor am I a charity. The bill needs to be paid by 5:00 p.m. today. Otherwise, you can deal with the consequences. I hung up immediately after speaking. I knew Julian was now at a dead end. He wouldn't dare ask my father for money, and he wouldn't borrow from his so-called friends either, because the moment he opened his mouth, he would be admitting his predicament. The only thing he could do was to beg Mia to use the ill-gotten gains she had. And that was exactly what I wanted. At 4:30 p.m., I received a call from the private nurse I had planted in Mia's room. Her voice was gloating as she reported to me. Dr. Reed, you won't believe what happened. Dr. Croft and Miss Vance got into a huge fight in her room. According to the nurse, Julian had gone to ask Mia to pay her medical bills that afternoon, but Mia had flatly refused, claiming she didn't have a penny to her name. All her money had been spent on the Porsche and some financial products and couldn't be accessed immediately. A desperate Julian had then tried to sell Mia's Hermes bag. Mia had fought him tooth and nail, and the two had gotten into a heated argument that escalated into a physical altercation. Even with one broken arm, Julian was still a man. In his desperation, he had pushed Mia, who lost her balance and hit her face on the corner of the headboard. Did the wound reopen? I asked coolly. That was the crucial point. It did. The newly sutured area on her left cheek split open a little. It's still oozing blood. There was excitement in the nurse's voice. Good. I hung up, and a cold smile touched my lips. I picked up the landline on my desk and connected to the general surgery nurse's station. Please inform Dr. Julian Croft that his patient, Miss Mia Vance, has suffered a post-operative wound dehiscence due to external trauma and requires an immediate secondary debridement and suturing. Tell him to come to my office right now to sign the surgical consent form. 5 minutes later, Julian appeared at my office door, his face ashen. He looked at me, his lips trembling like a death row inmate awaiting judgment. I pushed a new surgical consent form and a pen in front of him. My voice was calm. Dr. Croft, you already know the situation. A secondary suturing procedure carries a higher risk than the first. The tissue is already edematous and inflamed, so the probability of post-operative hypertrophic scarring is much higher. And all costs for this surgery must be paid in full upfront. Think carefully before you decide whether to sign. Julian's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white. He stared at the consent form as if it were a death warrant. He knew that if he signed, he would have to come up with another huge sum of money. If he didn't, Mia's face would be completely ruined. And he knew that the ledgers Mia held could send him to hell at any moment. In the end, like a completely tamed beast, he picked up the pen. He signed his name on the form. His handwriting was a shaky, pathetic scrawl. I took the consent form with satisfaction and looked at his defeated back. My heart was cold. Julian, you think you're signing for Mia's face? No. You just signed a critical condition notice for your own future, one that leads to an irreversible demise. And I will be the sole attending surgeon for this procedure. Julian eventually managed to pay for Mia's second surgery. I don't know how. Maybe he sold his prized watch, or maybe he borrowed more money from the loan shark. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had fallen completely into the mire I had dug for him, sinking deeper and deeper with no way out. Mia's second suturing surgery, I performed it perfectly as well. I meticulously debrided the necrotic tissue at the edges of the reopened wound and used even finer cosmetic sutures for a more precise subcutaneous closure. On the surface, once the wound healed, it would look even flatter than after the first surgery. But only I knew that when I sutured the deep fascia, I had deliberately applied greater tension to the sutures. This excessive tension would continuously stimulate the overgrowth of fibrous tissue during the healing process, eventually forming an ugly, depressed scar that no scar removal product could ever erase. This face would become Mia's lifelong nightmare and an eternal brand of Julian's foolishness and greed. While they were consumed by this face, another net I had cast was quietly closing in. I compiled all the raw data of Julian's academic fraud, the comparisons of the modified traces, the surveillance footage of him smashing the safe and borrowing from the loan shark, and the bank transaction records proving he took kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies into a detailed anonymous tip package. I didn't submit this package directly to the hospital's internal audit department. That was too direct and could easily be suppressed by my father's connections. What I wanted was a wildfire ignited from the outside, one that no single person's power could extinguish. I sent this package via an encrypted email to 3 institutions with significant influence in the country's academic and media circles: the nation's most authoritative academic misconduct whistleblowing platform, a renowned current affairs journal, famous for its in-depth investigative reporting, and the Federal Office of the Inspector General. After sending them, I deleted all trace of my actions. Then I calmly returned to my daily work. I began to select the first batch of candidates for my Phoenix project and started drafting detailed surgical plans for them. The faces marred by the scars life had carved were in my eyes more worthy of being treated with the gentlest of care than any work of art. The storm broke with more fury than I had anticipated. A week later, the homepage of the Current Affairs Journal featured a headline: "Shadows in the Ivory Tower, the academic alchemy and gray area profits of star surgeon Julian Croft, an in-depth investigation." The article, supported by detailed evidence, laid out how Julian had used data manipulation to obtain research grants and academic status, and how he had used his position to collude with pharmaceutical sales rep Mia Vance, accepting huge kickbacks and introducing expensive consumables into the hospital, ultimately passing the cost on to patients. My name was absent from the article, but it mentioned that Julian had been able to rise through the ranks so quickly thanks to his hospital director, father-in-law, and his surgeon wife. It even published the surveillance footage of him smashing the safe as a key piece of evidence. A single stone stirred 1,000 waves. The article garnered hundreds of thousands of views within hours and was frantically reposted by various news outlets. Public opinion was completely inflamed. The Department of Health and Human Services and the OIG took the matter seriously, immediately forming a joint investigation team that officially stationed itself at the Langford Medical Center to conduct a full-scale investigation into Julian. The hospital itself was in an uproar. No one could have imagined that the usually gentle and promising Dr. Croft had such dirty dealings hidden behind his facade. My father, the director, seemed to age 10 years overnight. He called me into his office, closed the door, and looked at me, his eyes complex and weary. "Evelyn, tell me, does all of this have something to do with you?" I didn't hide anything. I calmly told my father everything: how I discovered Julian's affair and his transfer of assets, how he sold me out for money. I even laid out all the evidence Ethan Cole had gathered before him. My father was silent for a long time. He smoked one cigarette after another. The office filled with smoke, just like my oppressive, suffocating marriage of the past decade. Finally, he stubbed out a cigarette and let out a long sigh. The sigh was filled with apology for me, and disappointment, and anger towards Julian. I misjudged the man. He stood up and patted my shoulder, his gaze firming again. Evelyn, you did the right thing. Our family can be kind, but we can never be weak. This kind of poison fungus must be pulled out by the roots. Don't worry. I will fully cooperate with the investigation team on this matter, and will not tolerate it. I will make sure none of this mud splashes onto you. With my father's support, the last weight in my heart lifted. Julian was immediately suspended from his duties and placed under investigation at a designated location. In front of the experienced, sharp-eyed veterans of the investigation team, Julian's pathetic psychological defenses crumbled almost instantly. To survive, to protect his white coat and his hard-won position, he made a decision that didn't surprise me at all but disgusted me to my core. He deflected all blame. He tearfully confessed to the investigators that everything was the fault of the pharmaceutical sales rep, Mia Vance. He claimed that Mia had seduced him with her beauty and various schemes, forcing him to violate regulations and use certain companies' medical devices. He said the so-called kickbacks were things Mia had forced on him and that he had only made a momentary unforgivable mistake in a moment of confusion. He painted himself as a victim corroded by beauty and blinded by greed. He mercilessly dumped all the dirty water, all the guilt onto the woman still lying in a hospital bed, the woman who had once shared his bed in an attempt to wash himself clean. This news reached Mia's ears immediately through an informant I had planted within the investigation team. And this was the perfect detonator for the final bomb. When a nurse relayed Julian's testimony to Mia, she was in her hospital room receiving a cold compress on her face from a caregiver. The stitches on her face had been removed, and though there was still some swelling, her recovery was going well thanks to expensive imported scar removal cream. She was even fantasizing that once this storm passed, she could use the money she got from Julian to go abroad for more advanced laser resurfacing and start a new life in another city. He really told the investigators that it was all my doing. Mia shot up from the bed. The facial mask she was wearing slid off due to the sudden movement, revealing a face full of new, not yet fully healed scars. In her extreme anger and disbelief, her face became even more contorted and ugly than it had been at the scene of the accident. Yes, Miss Vance. The nurse I had specially assigned to her sighed sympathetically. I heard from the investigators that Dr. Croft has now identified you as the main culprit. He says he was deceived and coerced by you. The police might even come to take you in for questioning soon. Julian Croft, you bastard! Mia completely broke down. She had believed that Julian loved her. She had thought that as long as she got rid of the wife, she could grandly take her place as Mrs. Chief of Surgery. She never imagined that when crisis struck, the man who had whispered sweet nothings to her would not only use her as a shield without hesitation, but would even try to send her to prison himself. Fine. If you're going to be like that, then I won't hold back either. Desperation and anger made Mia lose all reason. She scrambled out of bed and from an inner pocket of her Birkin bag took out a small, pretty pink USB drive. It was her last resort, a weapon she had once intended to use to blackmail Julian for more benefits. Inside were audio recordings of Julian counting kickback money in a hotel room, and videos of him drunk on several occasions boasting about how he had cleverly manipulated experimental data to deceive review boards, and how he had used my father's connections to climb to where he was today. From the remote surveillance feed on my office computer, I watched as Mia, like a madwoman, stormed out of her room and handed that pink USB drive directly to the head of the investigation team, who happened to be in a meeting in the general surgery office. I picked up the black coffee on my desk and took a light sip. The bitterness of the coffee spread slowly on my tongue, but the aftertaste was unprecedentedly sweet. The grand saga I had so carefully directed, this drama of dogs biting dogs, had finally reached its most climactic, most bloody scene. Thanks to the decisive evidence provided by Mia, the investigation proceeded very smoothly. Julian's psychological defenses completely collapsed, and every crime he had tried to hide and whitewash was laid bare in the face of ironclad proof. At the same time, Mia was formally charged by the police for commercial bribery. Before the wounds on her face had even fully healed, she was put in cold handcuffs. From a glamorous pharmaceutical sales rep, she became a prisoner overnight. On the day she was taken away, many people from the hospital came to watch. She was wearing a blue and white striped patient gown, her hair a mess. Her once arrogant face was now filled only with despair and resentment. As she passed my office, she looked up and stared at me with eyes that could almost devour a person. I didn't flinch. I met her gaze calmly, even giving her a slight nod as if seeing off a stranger. What she wanted to see was my triumph, my mockery, but what I gave her was complete cold indifference. A piece that had already been removed from the chessboard wasn't even interesting enough for a second glance. Half a month later, the hospital's decision on Julian was announced: termination of employment, revocation of his medical license, and official transfer of all evidence of his criminal activities to the judicial authorities. I saw the official notice stamped with a red seal on the hospital bulletin board. The once proud photo of Julian on his ID badge was printed at the top of the notice with a stark red terminated stamp across it, making it particularly jarring. I stood there quietly for a long time. In my heart, there was none of the expected elation, only a hollow exhaustion. 10 years. I had spent the best 10 years of my life cultivating a poisonous weed. Now I had finally uprooted it with my own hands. But my garden had also been left in ruins because of it. That evening, I returned to the home that had long been devoid of Julian's presence. I packed up his last remaining belongings, a few old clothes he hadn't taken, a couple of professional books he had once read into a box, and threw it in the apartment building's dumpster. Then I poured myself a glass of wine, sat in the empty living room, and called Ethan Cole. "Ethan, it's over, isn't it?" "No," Ethan's voice came through the phone, calm and powerful. "For you, Professor, it's just beginning. Dr. Reed, you have won a brilliant war of annihilation. Now it's time to clean up the battlefield and rebuild your new world." Rebuild. I looked at the myriad lights of the city outside the window. For the first time, I felt that a world without Julian could be so bright. My surgery wasn't over. The necrotic flesh had been debrided. Now came the long, hopeful process of disinfection and suturing. Julian's case caused a huge stir in the hospital, but for me personally, life seemed to return to a state of calm. I threw myself back into my work, pouring all my energy into preparing for the Phoenix Project. Selecting patients, drafting surgical plans, coordinating budgets with the foundation staff, I was incredibly busy. This kind of busyness, which existed purely to help others, was like a healing balm, slowly mending the deep wounds in my heart. But I had underestimated the counterattack of a cornered rabid dog. Just as Julian was transferred to the judicial system and awaiting trial, he used what little connections he had left to contact a YouTuber with over 1 million subscribers, a man famous for exposing scandals in various industries. 2 days later, a highly polished, extremely inflammatory short video titled "A Star Surgeon's Fatal Revenge: Private Justice Under the Scalpel, Is This Salvation or Public Retaliation?" went viral across all social media platforms. In the video, Julian, wearing a mask and a hat that revealed only his bloodshot eyes, went by the pseudonym Mr. C. He appeared in an in-depth interview with the YouTuber, presenting himself as a repentant but brutally retaliated against victim. He tearfully admitted that his affair was wrong, that he deserved to be condemned. But he claimed that his wife, Evelyn Reed, as the country's top plastic surgery expert, had deliberately performed excessive and unnecessary tissue debridement during the facial reconstruction surgery of a third-party miss. V, and had severed some key facial nerves, leaving the victim with permanent, irreversible scars. He also released a maliciously edited audio clip of me. All context was stripped away, leaving only a few of my cold, emotionless words. "Her face is stitched up. Whether it will leave a scar? That's in God's hands. I will personally come and rip out every single one of your stitches." This audio was paired with a few close-up shots of Mia's face when her wound had become infected and was oozing yellow pus in reality. A severe infection caused by her own failure to follow post-op instructions and her use of cheap, low-quality cosmetics to cover the scars. The visual impact was intense. In an instant, the anger of the entire internet was ignited. Public opinion completely reversed overnight. The comment section of the video was flooded with curses and insults. "This is terrifying. Is that a doctor? She's a demon in a white coat. The mistress is hateful, sure, but for a doctor to use her profession to retaliate against a patient is a complete lack of medical ethics. Someone like that has no right to be a doctor. Revoke her license, dox her, release all the information on this vicious woman." My social media accounts were overrun by angry netizens within hours. My DMs were filled with all sorts of unspeakable insults and death threats. The hospital's main phone line was ringing off the hook. A group of self-proclaimed concerned citizens even gathered at the hospital entrance with banners that read, "Unethical Dr. Evelyn Reed, get out of our hospital." My father came to see me personally. His expression was grim, his eyes filled with helplessness and fatigue. "Evelyn, I know you've been wronged, but this has gotten too big. It's seriously affecting the hospital's reputation," he sighed. "The board has decided it would be best for you to take a leave of absence for now, to lie low until this blows over. When things calm down, we'll figure out what to do." I didn't argue or explain. I just calmly placed my ID badge and my lab keys on his desk. "Dad, thank you for your concern, but I have no intention of hiding." I looked at him, my gaze firm. "Just give me 3 days. In 3 days, I will give the hospital everyone concerned about this matter and myself a clear and unequivocal explanation. I walked out of the director's office past the pitying, curious, and even gloating stares of my colleagues. As I was swarmed by a horde of reporters at the main entrance, I didn't say a word. I just got into a waiting black sedan under the protection of security guards. "How are you holding up? Should I find you a place to lay low for a few days?" From the driver's seat, Ethan Cole looked at me. There was no pity in his eyes, only a hard-to-detect hint of amusement mixed with concern. I fastened my seatbelt and looked at the frenzied reporters outside. A cold smile touched my lips. Why would I hide? This debridement surgery has just reached the most critical phase, cutting to the bone. I can't stop now. I turned to Ethan. If Julian wants to fight a war of public opinion with me, then I'll let him experience what a truly professional, precise, and eternally unhealable public opinion wound feels like. 3 days later, the International Academic Auditorium at the Langford Medical Center was packed. I, Evelyn Reed, was holding my personal press conference. There were no tears, no pleas for sympathy, not even a single word of self-defense. The venue was set up less like a scandal clarification and more like a rigorous, high-level medical academic lecture. The giant LED screen displayed the theme of the press conference, a technical review and factual clarification of a case of severe facial trauma reconstruction surgery. I stood at the podium in a chic white suit. My lawyer, Ethan Cole, sat beside me in his formal barrister's robes. In the audience were reporters from all of New York City's major media outlets and several influential online personalities, including the very YouTuber who had posted the attack video against me. Ladies and gentlemen of the press and all netizens concerned with this matter, good morning. Ethan was the first to stand, his loud, steady voice instantly quieting the room. Before my client, Dr. Evelyn Reed makes her statement, we will first watch the complete, unedited, high-definition video of the entire surgical procedure as recorded according to standard operating room protocols. As he finished speaking, all the lights in the auditorium dimmed. The screen lit up with the scene inside the operating room showing Mia's bloody, mangled face in stark detail. Then my hands, gloved and holding a scalpel, appeared in the high-definition surgical field. The camera was focused on the surgical site under the microscope. My hands were as steady as a rock, performing millimeter-level precise maneuvers between the web-like blood vessels and nerves. Please look at the screen. I picked up a laser pointer. The red dot landed precisely on a hair-thin white structure on the screen. My voice, amplified by the microphone, echoed clearly throughout the auditorium. This structure is the buccal branch of the human facial nerve. Its diameter is only about 0.5 millimeters, and it controls the muscle movements of the forehead and eye area. In the so-called exposé circulating online, Mr. C claimed that I severed this nerve. But the truth is, I pressed a button on the controller in my hand, and the video began to play in slow motion during the debridement process. Not only did I not touch this nerve, but I spent a full 40 minutes under a 20x surgical microscope using microforceps finer than a human hair to carefully dissect away every tiny glass shard embedded around the nerve bundle. And look here. My laser pointer moved to the sutured area. This is a photograph of the skin flap alignment immediately after the surgery. I used a layered, tension-reducing cosmetic suturing technique that I developed myself. This technique minimizes skin tension and reduces the probability of hypertrophic scarring. I can responsibly say that there are fewer than 3 surgeons in this country who can independently perform this level of suturing. The auditorium was completely silent. The only sounds were the rhythmic beeps of the monitor and the crisp clink of instruments from the video. The reporters in the audience were stunned by the almost artistic surgical scene. But this was not the end. Ethan Cole stood up. Staff, please play the next video. What appeared on the screen was surveillance footage from inside Mia's hospital room. The video clearly recorded how during the critical post-operative recovery period, she had disobeyed doctors' orders, secretly smoking and drinking in her room, and even applying thick, irritating, chemical-laden foundation to cover her scars. As you can see, the root cause of the patient's subsequent wound infection and hypertrophic scarring was the patient's own serious violation of post-operative care instructions, which allowed bacteria to invade the wound and cause a severe inflammatory response. I calmly explained into the microphone, medicine is a rigorous science, not an all-powerful magic. A doctor can suture the wounds on a patient's body, but we cannot suture the foolishness in a patient's mind. A murmur went through the crowd. The truth was already self-evident. But what I was here to do today was not just to clarify. Ethan Cole took the microphone, his expression solemn. He pressed the remote. What appeared on the big screen were clear, red-stamped evidentiary documents, the irrefutable proof of Julian's academic fraud, the original draft of the falsified data in his paper, and the clear, illegal flow of funds between the accounts in Mia's name and various pharmaceutical companies, proving her role as an intermediary for commercial bribes. Mr. Julian Croft. That is Mr. C in the video, fearing the imminent exposure of his academic misconduct and commercial bribery, deliberately and maliciously edited audio recordings and fabricated facts to viciously slander and defame my client Dr. Evelyn Reed in an attempt to divert public attention and manipulate public opinion. Ethan's voice was powerful and resolute. This is no longer a simple moral issue, but a criminal act of defamation and commercial bribery under the law. We have already formally submitted all evidence to the judicial authorities. Finally, I stood at the podium once more. I took off the sunglasses that had shielded my face for the past few days, revealing a pair of eyes that, though weary, were still clear and firm. I looked directly into the countless camera lenses in the audience. I am a surgeon. I have taken the Hippocratic Oath. I revere life, and I abide by my professional conscience. I have no intention of using the scalpel in my hand to retaliate against anyone who has harmed me, because those people, and those events which are already rotten from the inside out, are not worth dirtying my hands over. As for Mr. Julian Croft and Miss Mia Vance, I believe that the law will perform the most just, most thorough surgery on them. My press conference was like a massive bomb that completely upended public opinion. The tide turned with an earth-shattering reversal within a single hour. The netizens who had been lambasting me online were now frantically deleting their comments and swarming the YouTuber's account, demanding an apology for his false reporting. Wow, what a plot twist. This is what you call a class act. So cool. That Croft guy is disgusting. The scum of the earth. Fraud kickbacks and then trying to frame his wife. Is this the power of professionalism, holding a press conference like an academic lecture? That's just a next-level attack. My name was on the trending topics list again, but this time it wasn't as a villainous but as a queen's counterattack. The court's verdict came faster than I had expected. In the face of irrefutable evidence, any defense from Julian and Mia was pale and powerless. In the end, Julian was convicted of multiple counts of commercial bribery, embezzlement, and misappropriation of funds. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison, and all of his illegal gains were confiscated. He would never again be able to wear the white coat he had been so proud of. Mia, as the briber, was sentenced to 3 years in prison due to the large sums involved and the malicious nature of her crimes. My divorce from Julian also proceeded very smoothly. Due to his major faults of infidelity and transfer of marital assets during the marriage, the court ruled that I would receive 70% of the marital property and that he would have to pay me alimony. On the day of the sentencing, I was in the courtroom gallery. Julian was in a gray prison uniform, his head shaved. He looked as if all the life had been drained out of him overnight, looking at least 10 years older. He looked over the defendant's dock and saw me in the front row. His lips moved, his eyes filled with regret, resentment, and a complex emotion I couldn't decipher. But in the end, he lowered his once arrogant head, defeated. Mia's condition was even worse. Without professional medical care in detention and in a state of prolonged emotional collapse, the scars on her face had proliferated even more severely, looking like ugly red worms crawling on her face. This face would never again be capital she could use to gain any benefit. The moment the judge's gavel fell, I felt an unprecedented sense of peace. There was no elation of a great revenge, no heart-wrenching sorrow. It was as if I had just completed a difficult, time-consuming tumor removal surgery. Once the lesion was successfully removed, all that was left was a faint exhaustion along with a sigh of relief. I walked out of the majestic courthouse doors. The afternoon sun was dazzling, and I couldn't help but squint. I took out the wedding ring from my purse, the one that had once symbolized our love and promises. It was a platinum Tiffany ring, engraved with our initials on the inside. I watched it glint coldly in the sunlight. Then I walked over to a trash can by the courthouse steps and let it go. I let it fall into the darkness with a nearly inaudible crisp sound, just as I would discard a used, disposable surgical glove stained with blood and bacteria. Ethan Cole's car was parked across the street. He saw me come out but didn't honk, just waited quietly. I opened the car door and got in. "It's over." He handed me a bottle of water and asked quietly. I unscrewed the cap and took a long drink. The cold liquid slid down my throat, seeming to wash away the last bit of heat from my heart. "The debridement and the suturing are both complete," I said slowly, looking out the window. Julian and Mia were like a malignant tumor that grew quietly in my life. For a time, it was so well disguised that I even mistook it for a part of me. But when it turned malignant and began to erode my healthy tissue, the only choice was to use the swiftest means to resect it completely cleanly right down to the root. The excision was painful, and it has left an indelible scar on my life. But as long as it's cut out cleanly, the wound will eventually heal, form new tissue, and be reborn. Epilogue. With Julian imprisoned and Mia facing justice, the storm that had swept through the Langford Medical Center finally subsided. With the position of Chief of General Surgery now vacant, many assumed that considering my seniority skills and contributions, my father, the director, would naturally appoint me to the position as a form of compensation and comfort. But I declined. I no longer had any interest in such administrative roles or power struggles. I submitted a detailed proposal to the hospital, applying for the establishment of a new independent charitable project. I named it the Phoenix Project. The project's goal was to provide free, high-level plastic and reconstructive surgery to underprivileged women who had suffered severe facial disfigurement due to domestic violence accidents or other misfortunes. I donated all the marital assets I had recovered from Julian as ruled by the court, as well as my alimony, a total of nearly $500,000 as the initial funding for this public welfare fund. The money that had once been stained with filth and betrayal was finally being used in the cleanest, most meaningful way. My application received the full support of the hospital and the Department of Health. My clinic was also moved from the original outpatient area to a quieter, more private, independent space. The walls were no longer covered with cold medical charts, but with plaques and letters of gratitude from my recovered patients. But what moved me the most were not the plaques with their flowery words. It was the simple gratitude of a rural woman whose face had been severely burned when her ex-husband threw boiling water on her. When she was discharged, she brought a basket of still warm eggs, laid by her own free-range chickens, and insisted on putting them in my hands. "Thank you, doctor," the woman said, her eyes welling up as she touched her own skin, which, though still faintly scarred, was now flat and smooth. "You've given me back my life. You've made it so I can hold my head up again, so I can live." In that moment, I saw the light in her eyes and looked down at my own hands. I felt that the scalpel in my hand was heavier and more sacred than at any other time in my professional life. It was no longer a tool for me to pursue the pinnacle of skill, nor a weapon for revenge. It was a wand of salvation for mending broken lives and bestowing hope and dignity upon others. On another Friday evening, I had just finished the Phoenix Project's 5th pro bono surgery. The patient was a young mother who had been burned on the face while saving her child from a fire. When I removed her final bandage and let her see her face in the mirror, still flawed but with its basic contours restored, she broke down in tears of joy. I gently patted her shoulder and told her this was just the first step, that there would be more refined reconstruction to come. "Remember," I told her, "every scar on your face is not a mark of ugliness but the bravest medal of a mother." After seeing the patient off, I took off the white coat I had worn all day and changed into my camel-colored trench coat. I walked out of the brightly lit hospital building. The evening breeze, carrying the coolness of early autumn, brushed against my face, clearing my mind. A black Volvo was parked quietly under a ginkgo tree by the road. Ethan Cole was leaning against the car door. Seeing me, he stubbed out the cigarette in his hand. "Off work, Dr. Reed." He rolled down the window, a gentle smile on his lips. "Would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner? To celebrate the first anniversary of your successful discharge from your old life." I opened the car door and sat in the warm passenger seat. "Where to?" I asked, fastening my seatbelt, looking at his profile clearly illuminated by the streetlights. "I have a place in mind," he said, not specifying. He started the car. "Let's go to the coast. I heard there's a meteor shower tonight." The car drove smoothly along the empty coastal highway. I rolled down my window. The salty sea breeze rushed in, ruffling my hair and blowing away the last traces of disinfectant from my body. I watched the brilliant lights of the city streak past outside the window, blurring into long, gorgeous lines of light in my vision. My thoughts drifted back to a time long ago. I remembered the Evelyn, who had once walked the emergency stairs in the dead of night, cautious and full of anticipation, just to bring Julian a warm bowl of soup. That naive, foolish Evelyn who had treated marriage as her life's work was already dead. She had died on that same cold night, also filled with the smell of disinfectant. The person I am now is Dr. Evelyn Reed, the founder of the Phoenix Project, a complete independent woman who can take charge of her own life. I no longer need to rely on anyone to prove my worth, nor do I need anyone's promises to feel secure. My hands can hold the world's coldest, sharpest scalpel to debride the ugliest rot, and they can also give the warmest, most powerful hug to others after the sutures are in place. That was enough. Ethan, I turned my head and called his name softly. Yes, he replied, his eyes on the road. Thank you. For that day in court. I paused, then added, for handing me the sharpest knife. Ethan laughed. In the darkness of the night, his eyes were brighter than the stars. He turned to glance at me, his gaze as soft as water. It was my honor to be your first assistant. The car sped up, driving towards the distant horizon into the endless night and the scattering of starlight. I knew that my new path in life, one full of scars but destined to heal, had just begun.